Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Edwards. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago, and we are pleased to have you here on this beautiful day to talk about the environment, climate change, and energy policy, and the contrast between the current presidential administration under President Trump, the Obama administration, how these issues are playing out in Congress and how they're playing out around the world. And we're pleased to have not only all of you with us, but an outstanding panel of experts to give us insights into what that path forward might look like as we go ahead. This event is part of the IOP's ongoing speaker series, where our goal here is to bring leading thought leaders to campus to engage with all of you on key issues of the day. We have a number of events coming up in our series, including a conversation tomorrow night where we'll turn the lens and get a congressional perspective on Trump's first 100 days in office. That will feature, among others, IOP fellow and former Republican Congressman Bob Dole of Illinois, as well as Democratic Congresswoman Cheri Bustos of Illinois, and Congressman Ro Khanna of California, who happens also to be, as some of you may know, an alum of the University of Chicago. That'll take place tomorrow night at the International House on campus, so we invite all of you to join us for that. One other quick programming note from the IOP. Next Tuesday, the UAE ambassador to Russia is coming to campus. Omar Saif Gobash, who some of you may know for his writings on letters to a young Muslim that have received tremendous international attention and acclaim. He'll be here in Chicago for a very special lunchtime conversation that will also take place at iHouse. That's next Tuesday, and encourage all of you to come. For tonight's event, we are so thrilled to be collaborating with our partners, the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, known by the acronym EPIC. So special thanks to Michael Greenstone, Sam Ori, and the team for their partnership on tonight's event, as well as the program on global environment featuring Director Sabina Sheikh, who will be leading tonight's conversation. I'll step aside in just a second and have Dylan Stafford here introduce our panel in full, but we're delighted to be collaborating with them to bring you tonight's session. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. First of all, it's a great time to make sure your phones are on silent. So if you can do so, I'm going to do the same right now. Also, for those who haven't been to the Quadrangle Club before, I want to point out that restrooms are on the first floor. So if you need to use the restroom, we have bathrooms, including single-user restrooms, on the first floor. Also, during the conversation tonight, we will open up the floor to audience questions. We'll have a microphone in the center aisle for you to line up at to pose your questions to the panel. Two things to note there. We ask that you keep your questions short and to the point, so we can get to as many of you as possible and make sure it's a question. The second thing is we reserve our first 3 questions for students in the audience, but we invite all of you to participate openly and freely thereafter. So without further ado, let me step aside and turn the floor over to Dylan Stafford, who's a first year in the college, majoring in public policy, minoring in history. He has been an events ambassador, helping us throughout the year here at the IOP with events just like this. He hails from New Mexico. Please join me in welcoming him to get us started.
Well, hello everyone, and thanks for making it out to today's event. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, 2016 was the hottest year on record, marking the 3rd year in a row that average global temperatures have hit record-setting levels. And as we all know, 2016 was also characterized by a rather, heated political environment on a whole host of issues, including the one on America's climate and energy policies. With a new president in the Oval Office and an administration seeking to reshape U.S. policy on these matters, the conversation we'll be having is an intensely important one, and we're lucky to be joined by a fantastic panel. Until this January, Brian Deese served as senior advisor to President Obama on climate and energy, where he worked closely with the president in negotiating and finalizing the Paris Climate Agreement that was signed in December of 2015. Before taking on the role of senior advisor, Mr. Deese was deputy director of the Office of Budget and Management in the White House. He worked on the National Economic Council and was also the economic policy director for Hillary Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign. Governor Jennifer Granholm, a current IOP fellow whose seminars you should attend, was the first woman to be elected governor of Michigan back in 2002. She handily won re-election in 2006 and led the state as it was hit by the Great Recession and the auto industry crisis. Governor Granholm worked aggressively to make Michigan a center of clean energy development. She's now a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Berkeley Energy and Climate Institute, where she founded the American Jobs Project. She advised Clinton's 2016 campaign on jobs and energy policy, and she's now a senior contributor to CNN as well. Professor Michael Greenstone is the Milton Friedman Professor in Economics and is the director of the Energy Policy Institute here at UChicago. His research focuses on estimating the costs and benefits of our energy policies. Professor Greenstone was also the chief economist for President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. Jeffrey Homestead is a partner at Bracewell, where he represents a number of top energy companies and heads the Environmental Strategies Group. Recognized as one of the nation's leading lawyers on matters of climate policy, Mr. Homestead also served as assistant administrator of the EPA, working on air and radiation issues in the George W. Bush administration. And of course, moderating the discussion is UChicago's own Sabina Sheikh, who is the director of the the program on global environment and is a senior lecturer. She's conducted extensive research on environmental issues. So with that, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our frankly overqualified panel. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Dylan, and thanks to the Institute of Politics and the Energy Policy Institute for inviting us at the program on global environment to be a part of this. It's hard to be introduced after this panel here, but so as Dylan said, we have a very overqualified team, and I think, Dylan, your introduction was far better than what I was going to give, so I'm going to leave it at that. And we have a wealth of experience and knowledge on the stage, as you've all heard, and we have less than an hour, I believe, to talk to them. So with that, I'm just going to jump right in, if that's okay with all of you. So I wanted to start with Brian, since you're sitting next to me. And so I want to talk really, I'd like to just survey the current landscape of climate and energy policy. And in particular, there's a lot of attention on Obama-era policies. I think everyone has heard about the Clean Power Plan and the Paris Agreement, at least in name. But some of the provisions and some of the other programs that were accomplished under Obama maybe flew under the radar a little bit. So if you could just talk to us about what was addressed during the administration and where we stood at the time of transition.
Sure. So I think the best way to think about the Obama administration's approach to climate and energy policy writ large is it was an aggressive and creative approach to using second best policy to address a pressing issue. And by that I mean the first best approach, which was something that we actually tried to get done early on in the administration, was to establish a economy-wide carbon price. At that point, we were looking at it through a cap and trade mechanism. You can do it through a carbon tax or otherwise. There's positive and negatives to that debate, but at the end of the day, establishing a uniform carbon price economy-wide is the sort of first best policy way to try to go at reducing emissions in an economically efficient way. We didn't have that card within our deck for a whole set of reasons that we could talk more about, but what that led the administration to do is try to look sector by sector and identify how, with regulatory tools, could we act within the legal authorities that we had, but in a way that helped try to set rules of the road to encourage a path toward clean energy and lower emissions trajectory. So if you think about the major sectors of the economy, in the power sector, our approach was the Clean Power Plan, which there's been a lot of talk about it, but in very basic terms, what it does is it sets limits associated with emissions from existing coal-fired power plants. In the transportation sector, which is another big generator of emissions, our focus was principally around fuel economy standards for cars, which we worked on when Governor Granholm and I were working on the auto industry crisis early on in the administration, but also for trucks as well going forward. For the built environment, for commercial and residential buildings, we focused on setting efficiency standards and also then working with industry and working with private partners to try to encourage greater energy efficiency adoption as well. And then we also looked at the oil and gas sector and tried to establish rules that balanced the need to maintain U.S. Production with the need to also reduce emissions and increase safety standards around things like fracking and around things like methane emissions associated with oil and gas activity. So our strategy was to try to use the regulatory tools that were in place to try to encourage emissions reductions across the economy, with the understanding that we didn't have the tool within our deck to do it in a simple and easy way. But at the same time, we did have a way to do it sector by sector that was both lawful but also created economically reasonable rules that, as Michael could talk about in more detail, his costs were significantly outweighed by the benefits of taking those actions.
Great, thank you. And I want to come back to this idea of second best policies and when we get to questions for Michael. But I wanted to go sort of not in geographic order here, but I want to jump over to Jeff there and ask you, you've called for a more reasonable and balanced regulatory framework for climate change. And I wonder if you can tell us from your perspective what that looks like and if that requires this complete rollback of the Clean Power Plan, or are there certain provisions that we keep and go forward with?
Well, Brian went to great pains to explain how everything they did was lawful. And I think there's a big difference of opinion, especially when it comes to the Clean Power Plan. And I won't get into all the details there, but I think everybody here would agree that it's a pretty creative interpretation of the Clean Air Act, one that had never been adopted before. And in essence, what EPA tried to do was something that had always been left to the states, and that was to decide what kinds of generating facilities would be allowed. And EPA's approach would have basically required over time about 30% of the existing coal-fired fleet to be shut down and to be replaced by wind and solar. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it was certainly a novel interpretation of the Clean Air Act, and that was also stayed by the Supreme Court. So it never really went into effect. It's not in effect now. And I'm pretty confident that it will be revoked and hopefully replaced by something else. You know, the other, let me come back to something else that Brian said and try to give myself a little more credibility. So I also worked in the first Bush administration in the White House, and that was during the debate over the what became the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. And I kind of was a first-hand witness to what it took to get that done. And what's amazing in retrospect is the time and the effort that the Bush White House put into getting that done. And not to be overly critical, and I understand there were politics and there were other priorities, but I think had we seen the administration do what the first Bush administration did, which was to actually put together a very detailed legislative proposal, put that up on the Hill, and then start, negotiating and making all the compromises that need to be made. And again, in the Bush administration, sometimes that involved pushing back on your own constituencies. And so there were times in the Bush White House when there was a feeling that certain industry groups were not being reasonable, and we basically called them on it and said, no, we think that this is something that's important to do. And we never, and again, for understandable reasons, that never happened during the Obama administration. There was never a proposal. The White House never got involved in kind of making the compromises that need to be made. I say all that because I really do think that to have an effective climate change policy, we're going to need to have legislation. And I think ultimately that will need to be led by the White House. I don't think that's a priority for this White House, so I don't think it's likely we'll see anything in the next 4 years. But I think ultimately that is what you need, because these regulatory policies really are second best or third or fourth best, and we get some sense of that now when you see how easy it is for a new administration to come in and just eliminate at least many of the regulations that were put in place, because when you do things by administrative action, they can, in many cases, be easily undone by administrative action. And that doesn't provide the kind of certainty that I think everybody would like to have.
Go ahead, Mike.
Can I shift the argument? I defer to both you and Brian on the legal side, but on the pure economic side, do you think there are ways to engage in regulations around climate that would be beneficial economically?
So are you asking me if we could do things that would pass a cost-benefit test?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that probably could be done. Within the current framework, it's not clear how aggressive those could be, and we'll have to get in discussion about social cost of carbon and how you do the benefits and all those other things. But I think there are some regulatory actions that could be taken. And by the way, I expect that some of these things will remain largely in place. The methane regulations for the oil and gas sector, I think most companies in that sector would like to have a reasonable regulation as opposed to no regulation at all. So I think that is possible.
Because the reason I'm asking is there's I know that this is not your view, but there's an element of well, there's always, we could do the mañana policy, and the difficulty with mañana never comes. And so climate change is a threat, and I know you agree with me about that. And so I guess what I was wondering is so there are existing set of authorities, and is there a way to drive on them? I guess now I'm going to make the question more complicated, both legal and economically beneficial.
So I think the easy answer is yes. There are things that would be legal, that would be economically beneficial. I don't know how much it would get you in the way of carbon reduction. I think that's the big issue.
Okay, and Brian, I'm sure you want to respond to that, so I want to give you a second here.
Well, look, I think a couple things. First is I think that it's important that you understand that the approach that the Obama administration took is second best because we were aware of that. But I think that it is absolutely wrong to suggest that second best is somehow not worth doing or either legally or economically flawed in some fundamental sense. I think the likelihood that you actually, I think that Jeff overstates the degree to which quote unquote administrative action can be easily undone, because I think it's not just in the methane space, it's even in the context of the Clean Power Plan. Without Jeff and I boring you all with a back and forth on the legal merits one way or another, it's going to be much more complicated than this administration and certainly this president tries to sell, that somehow you just rip these things out tooth and nail, have a snappy press conference at the EPA, and then all of a sudden these things go away. And I think in terms of the way in which the power sector is behaving, and I assume Jeff would probably agree with me on this, in terms of actual behavior in the power sector, they're looking beyond the legal fight that is inevitably going to tie things up over the next couple of years and anticipating that they're going to be operating in an environment with more constrained regulation going forward. So, the sort of near-term act of eliminating these regulations is not all that clear to begin with. And then you look at something like fuel economy, where again, I think it's important to look that the headlines associated with this administration's political approach to this is to suggest that with a stroke of a pen they can sort of eliminate all of this, all of the rules, and then all of the industry adaptation behavior associated with those. And what you've seen in the wake of that, even the last couple of weeks, is a sense that, okay, well, maybe we can't eliminate all of these because it turns out that California and other states actually have a lot of leverage embedded in their authorities under the Clean Air Act to have a say in what fuel economy standards are, or otherwise we end up with two disparate standards nationwide. So I actually think that if we all agree that climate is a pressing issue, it needs to be addressed, and we need to do so in a way where the benefits outweigh the costs, that this second best approach is actually quite important for the country. The last thing I'll say about the politics of the first best approach, look, the problem with getting a cap and trade bill passed early in the Obama administration had nothing to do with the White House's degree of engagement. There's a classic debate between Congresses and White Houses when things don't go well, where Congresses and other people say, well, it's because the White House didn't engage enough, and then the White House says it's because Congress kind of doesn't know what it's doing, and you just saw that play out in the context of healthcare. But the truth is, the reason why we weren't able, there was a very detailed plan. In fact, there was a piece of legislation that passed the House, and it sat in the Senate. It came close to passing in the Senate. It wasn't an issue of not having a detailed enough plan or having an engaged enough White House. It was an issue of bare knuckle politics associated with one party refusing to engage or let its members engage in the kind of back and forth legislative process that would have produced a better legislative outcome. And that's a problem that we're going to have to face, and I think we should face it directly in the politics rather than dancing around it. There's a proposal that was just put forward, a bipartisan proposal to couple an economy-wide carbon tax with regulatory reform. There's not a single Republican member of Congress who is willing to stand up and make the case that that is sensible policy. There's a couple Republicans who are joined a caucus to at least say that climate change is real. And that we should do something about it. And I'm not trying to be partisan when I'm saying this. I think we need to, if we all could agree that ultimately a legislative solution that addressed this issue in a holistic way is the right path forward, I think we also have to be clear-headed about what's the barrier to getting in that direction. And there is nothing that President Obama would have liked more than to have an opportunity to sit down in a good faith way and have a conversation with Republicans about how to come to some bipartisan compromise. But unfortunately, on this issue of climate change right now, that's not a safe space for the Republican Party to operate. And that's going to need to change if we're going to get serious about a legislative solution.
So let me step back for a minute starting with the current landscape and talk about where we are now. And so in terms of the executive order that was signed by President Trump, maybe Jeff, I know you're not a spokesperson for the current administration, but if you could tell us, what does the executive order do or not do, and what is its legal significance for things like mining on federal lands and the Clean Power Plan and potentially the Paris Agreement?
I think all of us who've worked in government would acknowledge that sometimes executive orders are more about politics than they are about substance. And there are many of the things in that executive orders that can only be done by the agencies. And so it kicked off a process that could have been kicked off in many other ways, but it was kicked off through the executive order. The president could essentially unilaterally, through the Secretary of Interior, change the moratorium, reduce the moratorium on coal leasing. I'm not sure how impactful that is because there's not a lot of people who are looking for those leases right now. Besides that, what you have is the beginning of some regulatory process, the Clean Power Plan, another rule for new coal-fired power plants, the methane rules. But one of the things that it did in fact do, although it remains to be seen how it will play out, and Michael can talk much more about this, is there was this social cost of carbon that was quite controversial. And the White House basically eliminated that, said we're not going to use it anymore, and they specifically disavowed a half dozen documents that were associated with that. The problem, though, is that there's many federal programs where you need to have some way of evaluating costs and benefits or looking at the climate change impacts. And even if you eliminate the guidance and the social cost of carbon, because of the way the laws are structured, you still need to take these things into account. So I could talk 45 minutes about this. I promise I won't. But really what
I could talk for 2 hours. So.
but really what the executive order does is kick off this process that will play its way out over the next 4 years. And we'll see what happens with a new social cost of carbon that won't be called that. It'll be called something else. The NEPA guidance was eliminated, but they will still have to have some way of showing that they evaluated the climate change impacts. Otherwise, NEPA evaluations will be struck down in court. So it's the beginning of a long process.
So let me turn to Michael and the social cost of carbon, right? And so I think in your op-ed in the New York Times last week or the week before, which a lot of us have read, you talked about before the executive order, we were looking at a social cost of carbon about $40 a ton. And with the executive order, it appears they're valuing it at less than $5 a ton. And a lot of this has to do with risk and discount rates. But can you talk a bit about that and the idea that as you said, if they abandon the social cost of carbon, we still are implicitly putting a value on that by the policies or things that are out there. So.
Yeah, so let me pick up on the important points Jeff is making. A lot of the regulations that govern how much carbon can be released in the atmosphere have some cost-benefit requirement to them. And so often these regulations, the benefit of them is reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. And then the costs are measured in costs on business or costs on households. So in order to have things on an even playing field, you have to have a way to turn the carbon reductions into money. And the way to do that is something called the social cost of carbon. And that is an estimate. I don't think it's very controversial, but Jeff and I think have slightly different views on it, is an estimate of the damages associated with the release of an additional ton of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we put a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, it's going to stay up there a couple hundred years, it's going to change climate, the climate is going to impose some costs and some benefits, and on net, what does that add up to? And before the executive order, it added up to about $40. And what I wrote about, to your question, Sabina, is a technical issue related to it but can really be described in how much do we value the future. And there's one approach where the Trump administration seems to be leaning, which is to place a very low value on what happens into the future. So one way to illustrate that is if you had $100 of damages in 100 years, the way they seem to be pointing towards, they would say that's worth 12 cents today. An alternative, which was kind of led to the $40 numbers, to value at about $5.20. So that's kind of at the heart, and it's important because it gives you a guidepost for how stringent the regulations can be.
Great, and I have one follow-up question for you, then I want to turn to Governor Granholm here. In terms of the cost-benefit analysis and the social cost of carbon, without getting too wonky, like what is the appropriate sort of time horizon when you talk about the future in 100 years, and also the appropriate spatial scale? So we're talking about global costs and benefits, given we're talking about global pollutants here?
Yeah, so I think the appropriate, purely from a blackboard standpoint, is appropriate time period is as long as the carbon's going to be in the atmosphere and changing the climate. So if that takes 200 years, that's how long it takes. There is another subtle issue about whether or not the U.S. should only count damages that occur within the United States or damages that occur around the globe. And my argument, and the argument that kind of helped drive the social cost of carbon calculation before the executive order, was that one should account for the global damages. And I think the strongest argument for that is that when the United States accounts for what happens outside other countries, that will provide leverage for the United States to get reductions from other countries. And so when other countries reduce CO2, that provides benefits to us. And so that, think of it as kind of a aiding international negotiation, which is incredibly important when one deals with a global pollutant like CO2.
Great, thank you. So my next question is for Jennifer. And so given what we're talking about and the calls for rolling back the Clean Power Plan or withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, what would you say is sort of plan B for supporters of climate policy? And in particular, like what is the role of states under a Clean Power Plan versus, if we don't have something like that?
Yeah. I know as I'm listening to this conversation, I'm thinking with my governor/politician hat, and in the states, the issue is, in most of the states, I should say, the issue is not climate. The issue is jobs. I see Exhibit A here, this young man with the green shirt about jobs. People care. This is the argument that is a more winning argument, is a jobs argument in many places. And so for states, the question is, what does that mean? How can states act in the absence of federal leadership? And I think the Clean Power Plan was obviously a stick approach to this. But one of the great things that the Clean Power Plan did was respect the states enough to give them a goal and allow them to come back and negotiate how they're going to achieve that goal. One of the, I did a seminar here yesterday, and we were talking about this, but one of the greatest moves of the Obama administration in terms of getting states to act voluntarily on something was the Race to the Top for education. And initially, they put out a $3.4 billion little carrot, and they said to the states, you can compete for this in your education realm, but the price to enter the competition was that you essentially have to raise your education, your high school standards, so that every child essentially takes a college prep curriculum. So they put this out there to lure the states into doing something. And lo and behold, 48 states ended up competing for this. So what they did was they ended up, and they all raised their standards, even though that not everybody got the money. We raised our standards in Michigan. We didn't get the money. I was so mad at y'all. But it caused massive policy changes all across the country, this little carrot. So the question is, if you translate that over to energy, is there a way that you can respect the states, offer a carrot, because every governor wants to create jobs, and label it as a job opportunity strategy, and see if there is a way to get states to raise their renewable portfolio standards or increase their energy efficiency standards, or however their most aggressive strategy is to come back in a competition. Now, if the federal government doesn't want to do it, I continue to push to say that I think there are players in the private sector that could put out a competition. Bloomberg, foundations in New York, Google, other places across the country, other, Gates, they could band together. And $4.3 billion is what it took to get a basically national energy strategy. Just challenge the governors to raise their standards and put it under the guise of what's the best policy for you to be able to create jobs. Let me just say one more thing about the jobs side of things, because you are a green shade accountant working for a company or an economist, you're looking at the growth of these products and the global demand for solar or wind or battery technology. And you just look at Navigant Research or Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and you look at the trajectory of growth for these products over the next, between now and 2020 and 2030. They're huge global demand. Where are those products going to be made? And this is the argument. Are we going to allow China to make the products, or are we going to do stuff that all of our economic competitors are doing to make them irresistible to those manufacturers and job providers? We should be strategizing as a nation about what our economic development strategy is in this clean energy space, or we are going to lose out on creating millions and millions of jobs.
Great, thank you.
Just saying.
Is it worth pointing out that one of us was a successful politician?
I think it's fairly obvious. So sometimes governors and mayors don't get along, right? So let's talk about cities. So the city of Chicago just announced that all public buildings are going to go to 100% renewable energy by 2025. So awesome. It's going to be the largest major city to have this commitment. How meaningful is this? Given the sort of lack of expansive regulatory power of cities, what role do cities play here? What can cities do?
This is the awesome part about cities. I mean, the mayors are nonpartisan to begin with, but they completely get the issue of jobs. So if all of the buildings in Chicago are going to be, energy efficient buildings, I mean, you got thousands of buildings in Chicago. What are those products that are going to go into those buildings to make them efficient, and where are they going to be made, those products? And really, it's a massive job creation. Mayors completely get this. Many governors completely get this. But every governor and every mayor wants to cut ribbons, to open businesses, to say who they're going to employ. That is really a great strategy. And I'm looking at Brian Deese, because he and I were in the trenches in the auto industry meltdown. And part of what the Obama administration did with Brian's great leadership was to offer states the opportunity to lead in economic development in, for example, creating the lithium-ion battery for the electric vehicle. They put out a series of challenges or competitions to the governors. Everybody competed. Proud to say Michigan got more than half of them. But all of that was because we we had a strategy, an economic development strategy to be able to do that, which created jobs, and by the way, really helps the planet a lot. And our legislature, and I had a Republican legislature, Republican House and Republican Senate, they were all about the jobs part of it. They were all about it. So if we can just, from a political side, not from a legal side, not from an economic, well, from an economic side too, but from a political strategy, if this conversation could be about capturing jobs in the fastest growing sector, one of the fastest growing sectors in the globe, I think we would have better opportunity.
Let me just say one additional thing about mayors too. I think there's a real opportunity today, more so than when the Obama administration was in office, for mayors and governors to demonstrate how their leadership can actually drive international progress as well. So, today, if you look just across, just putting even mayors aside, if you just look at states with governors who are pledging publicly to continue progress toward having, clean energy economy and clean job strategies in their states, you represent about 40% of the population and 50% of the GDP of the country. And so that is an extraordinarily meaningful opportunity when you think about what Michael was saying. He said it in very technically accurate terms, but what he's saying is, in international negotiations, the typical argument that says if the United States does more, other countries do less, isn't actually true in this context. And that's accurate. That's what happened in the Paris context, and it's associated with the fact that most other countries are looking at the clean energy jobs race in the same way that Jennifer just described eloquently. They're looking to try to position themselves to compete and win as well. And so if you assume a scenario where the federal government is going to be stepping back from that table and not seeking opportunities to demonstrate that the United States is moving forward, that creates a hole, but it also creates a huge opportunity for effective policymaking, but also effective organizing and the political benefit and the jobs benefit that comes from that, from mayors and governors that are able to band together and say, hey guys, the 50% of the US economy is still one of the biggest economies in the world, and we're continuing to actually drive things forward in a way that, because of our great system of federalism in the United States, we can actually demonstrate progress on these issues, even if we're in an environment where the federal government is not actively taking the lead.
And these mayors, there was just like a month ago, 30 some odd cities said that they were going to band together to do a $10 billion investment in purchasing fleets of electric vehicles. That is a huge demand issue. And let me just say one other thing, sorry about this national competition, global competition. So I went with the Securing America's Future Energy, which is a group in Washington, D.C. to China, where they were doing a sort of dog and pony show about what jobs they were creating in clean energy through Chinese energy policy. And I was standing in the back of this dog and pony show with one of the mayors of a medium-sized, which is a huge Chinese city. And they were talking about biofuels. And he leans over to me and he says, so when is the US going to get national energy policy? And I said, oh my God, Congress, nothing's going to happen. And he just gets this big smile on his face and he says, take your time. Because they see our passivity as their opportunity to be able to do exactly that.
Great. So Michael and Jeff, why don't we get your thoughts, and then we have to move on to audience questions.
I just want to add, I agree. So first of all, I think maybe the unspoken truth here is that probably everyone on this panel would agree that a carbon price of some form would be an efficient way to address the climate problem. But I think it's also true that the politics are not there for that to happen right now. So one area where I see opportunity for states to be innovators and demonstrate for maybe some future day is by setting up carbon markets within their states and or linking them across places. And California has already done that. In the East Coast, there's the RGGI system, and some of the Canadian provinces have done that. So I think there is opportunity for kind of trial and error around some of the key issues when the politics turn a little bit.
Can I just come on that to take the opportunity to actually ask you that question, because I think you might have a better you have better insight into this than any of the three of us for sure. Which is, what do you, assuming that you agree with what Michael just said, what do you think is missing in terms of the policy or the rhetoric or otherwise in terms of getting more people in the center and the right of the political spectrum to be willing to publicly advocate for an efficient carbon price that actually would put us in a position to achieve all of these outcomes that we're all talking about?
And he means pegged to the social cost of carbon.
Well, we could, but no, I mean, all joking aside,
joke.
like, is it a concern that it will be too high, that Michael Greenstone will get his hands in there and drive the social cost? Is it just the threshold issue?
There's an awful lot embedded in all of these. Let me just make a couple of quick points if I can. Theoretically, I absolutely agree that the most efficient way to do this is to figure out what the true social cost of carbon is and to impose that price. I'm not sure, and I think Michael would probably agree, that you could come up with a pretty good argument for a social cost of carbon for a range that's a lot bigger than 39 to 41. And conveniently, I think the social cost of carbon kind of ended up in that place, and it's certainly supported technically, but it also tends to be at kind of the high end of what's politically feasible, I think. And you had people at EPA arguing for a much higher cost. You had people at other agencies arguing for a much lower cost. So the social cost of carbon, part of the problem with it now is it's so malleable that whoever's making the decisions can kind of decide based on discount rate and which studies you use, whether it's going to be 10 or whether it's going to be 200. The politics is tricky, and I would agree that for reasons that are rather complicated and it's kind of happened over time, because Democrats and in particular environmental activists have been pushing this so hard, people on the left, people on the Republican side are just skeptical of a lot of these regulatory approaches, and I'm a bit skeptical too. And I'm not a politician. I know this jobs argument is a great one to make politically, and by the way, I think governors and mayors are in a position to do lots of things, and we'll see how those play out over time. I will point out that in environmental law, we have a very long history of people getting political credit by setting tough targets in the future. By 2025, we're going to be 100% renewable energy. And I can also point to about as many cases where those goals are not even, you don't come close. So you get the political credit for setting those goals, but when you talk about what you actually have to do to meet them, it's a different thing. Just a note of caution on this jobs issue. And I suspect, although Michael may not want to agree with me, he would at least to some extent, that we're not going to create a lot of jobs by adopting regulations that don't pass the cost-benefit test. And when I talk to people, they say, "But look at you require people to put on scrubbers, and think of all the people who have jobs to build those scrubbers, and think of all these regulatory programs that would create jobs." And I say, well, we all like energy efficiency. So why don't we just have a rule that says every single window in the United States has to be replaced with new energy efficiency, the state-of-the-art triple glaze or whatever it is. Think of all the jobs that would create. All the people would have to tear out those windows, and you would have to dispose of them. You'd have to manufacture new windows. There would be millions of jobs to install those new windows. And why don't we do that? Well, the answer is because if that money wasn't being spent on windows, it would be spent on other things that people value more. And that's the problem with all of these arguments. So I understand the job argument sells politically, but economically, I'm not so sure.
Except every other country, doesn't buy that argument that you just made.
I think most other economists in most other countries do agree with that.
Oh, maybe the economists do. Maybe the economists do. And then I guess that's a bigger question about whether we base our policy decisions and our jobs decisions purely on a cost-benefit analysis.
So I greatly overestimate how many questions I could ask, because I have about 10 more. But I want to give the people in the audience the opportunity to ask questions. And I think we wanted to have students ask the first 3 questions. So are you ready to go?
I'm a student.
Go ahead.
So my name is Ronan Shatsky. I'm a first year in the college. And my question actually follows directly from this conversation. So as you all know, it was under Nixon's administration that the EPA was formed, right? And they passed several extensions to the Clean Air Act under his administration, a Republican. So I wonder if you could talk more about what has actually changed in the Republican Party that has made them so unwilling to support any kind of legislation, any kind of regulation, which previously passed without much controversy today.
Well, that sounds
Probably
like
to you.
that sounds like a question.
No, I'm sure anyone can
No,
weigh
no,
in.
I think that should be to everyone. I don't
Yeah,
think,
yeah.
I don't, Jeff is not here to.
So here's
Yeah.
here's my reaction to that. Back in the 1970s, there were very clear and obvious environmental issues that everybody could see and feel, and whether you're talking about rivers catching on fire or rivers where you couldn't swim or air quality where you couldn't see things, and so politically it was important for Republicans and Democrats alike to support those things. Over time, though, we have made enormous progress. I mean, it really is a remarkable achievement what we've done with water quality and especially with air quality. The problem that Republicans, I think, have is what's happened over time is that next additional increment turns out to be very expensive. And so the idea that, well, because you supported it in the past, you should continue to support it now may not make sense. Now, and again, I agree there's still cost-effective things we could do on climate change and other things, but to pretend that basically the situation is exactly the same, it's different. I mean, if you think
Jeff,
about...
I think that's a conflation. I mean, so, you're answering about criteria air pollutants, PM and ozone and things like that, and that's fine, that's one discussion. But really, I think the discussion is about CO2. And I
think he asked me about the Clean Air Act.
But let me pick
Well,
up.
but let me just
this.
also make one other point, like related to like the cost benefit analysis. Like, I let it slide about the $10, $200 for the social cost of carbon. Yes, of course, you can multiply a number and make it smaller. You could divide a number, or multiply and make it bigger, or divide and make it smaller. But really, the $40 a ton came from a quite reasoned approach. And so, like, if there's problems with the assumptions that went into it, then we should talk about those assumptions, but not that, if we multiply by 5, we can make it 200, or divide by 4, we can make it 10. That's not. I don't think that's productive.
So let me pick up on the first point that Michael said, and maybe surprise you guys by giving Republicans a little more credit, but then also pushing against one thing Jeff said, which is, I think if we talk about CO2 and we talk about climate as opposed to other environmental regulation, I think there's more hope in the fact that this change is sort of short-lived. It's important to remember that when I was working on the Obama campaign in 2008, this wasn't a high salient issue because actually both candidates, the Republican and the Democratic candidate for president, both supported the same basic approach to applying an economy-wide carbon price through some form of cap and trade. And you can debate about all of the details and the like, but the Republican candidate for president supported that approach. And in the prior election, the Republican candidate for president, who Jeff knows and works closely for as well, also had experience with and didn't support as part of his campaign platform, but had lots of experience with taking the exact same approach. Those were the Republican standard bearers for president. So I think that in some ways, the question, which I don't have the answer to, but is in some ways more corrosive but more near term, in the sense that there's something that's happened over the last several years. And if it helps in terms of changing the dynamic going forward, to suggest that maybe it was something about Republicans galvanizing as just wanting to be against what Obama was doing, then look, let's find the path. Let's find the path forward. But I think that that really the question is the Republican Party, including the Republican Party of the 2000s, was increasingly willing to stand up and publicly say that some form of economy-wide constraint on CO2 emissions was not only appropriate, but was smart economic policy as we looked at the climate threat and we looked at what other countries are doing. And so, to me, embedded in the way to distill down your question is what's happened since then that has made it so difficult for even those same Republicans. Why is it that John McCain can't be for what John McCain was for? And I think that's really, we need to answer that question if we're going to seriously get at, I think, what's underneath your concern.
I would just, I would say a little bit of the obvious of two things. One is a lot of the fossil fuel jobs are in red states, and it's real when people lose their jobs, and those politicians are affected by seeing their neighbors and their communities, especially in the coal country, et cetera. I would also say there is reality to the fact that some of the biggest, and this is a whole campaign finance argument, but some of the biggest funders of the Democratic Party have been interests in the fossil fuel industry, and I'm sure that has had some impact. Did I say
You said
Democrat? Oh, Republican. Thank you for the correction. Yes, no.
Let's take another question from a student, from an environmental studies major here.
Yeah, that's right. Hi, everyone. I'm a fourth year in the college. I'm Colin Parts. I'm also too tall. I'm a fourth year in the college. I'm studying environmental studies and public policy. And I wanted to ask the question about race and socioeconomic status. We talked about economics a lot, but there is truth to the statement that predominantly lower socioeconomic classes and predominantly people of color are affected by different environmental issues and by environmental pollutants disproportionately. And I'm wondering how we include the conversation on equality within this conversation on the economy within environmental issues.
I'll be happy to take a probably slightly unpopular viewpoint here. I think a challenge. Look, I think one thing that this discussion has probably illustrated is how challenging it is politically to talk about CO2 and to come up with something that addresses CO2. My own view is that, that's already a heavy lift, and then when you start layering things on top of it, it often does not make it easier. And so there might be more direct ways to achieve some of the very important goals that you highlighted around equality and equality of opportunity and racial justice. But by putting it all together into one mix, it can sometimes, I think, be counterproductive to both goals.
I disagree with that. I think that the environmental justice argument is a really important argument, particularly for the communities that are affected, but is it not also encompassed in the social cost of carbon, isn't it? I mean, the impacts on those communities are very real. Asthma, you name it, plus not to mention the...
So to be clear, I'm focusing on CO2, which doesn't directly cause...
I get that, but I get that. I get that.
In fact, I think it is confusing to try to talk about CO2 emissions in the context of environmental justice. And I know that various advocates have tried to do that, but it's hard.
harder.
And that's one of the things that's made California's AB 32 program, which is, whether you think it's good or bad, it's a pretty efficient program, and it's complicated California's efforts because people have made claims about how that affects people. So your question raises a whole host of issues, but I don't really think about those issues in the context of CO2.
Except that if you look at cap and trade and the question about how much of the benefit is invested in those communities, whether it's 35% of is invested in those communities, perhaps that investment is directly addressing some of the worst.
Right, but that's a tax policy. You're saying let's take the proceeds and invest it.
Right.
Let me try to do it in a way that I think is less confusing, which is it is about CO2, which is it is a fact that if you look at the impacts of global warming, those impacts are most pronounced in places where you have the least resources to adapt to the inevitable changes that are coming. That's true globally, which means that areas of the globe that are the least well situated to adapt are the most vulnerable. And it's true in the United States as well. And so when we think about policy, both in terms of mitigating CO2, but also adapting to the inevitable impacts that will come. I think it's not only reasonable, but I think it only makes sense to take that into account, or the policies are not going to be as effective. If you think about from a global perspective, and you're thinking about trying to address the inevitable issues that are going to happen because temperature is going to increase no matter what the policies are in place, and you're going to see sea level rise, and you're not attentive to the fact that, you know, the challenge that Miami Beach faces associated with sea level rise is a very different challenge that the bayou in Louisiana faces. And if we don't start with a clear-eyed understanding that that's the case, then we're going to make policy mistakes, because you wouldn't actually want your policy framework to address those two issues equally.
Great. Thank you.
Hi. So although it is a good story that some Chinese officials are very ambitious in terms of curbing carbon emission, but there is still another story that although China canceled lots of coal plants domestically, it still financed some new ones in Southeast Asia. And because of Trump administration's leaning on energy policy, perhaps there's no pressure for China to not to invest in those areas. So my first part of the question is about what is the implication of this situation in terms of social cost of carbon dioxide. And the other part of the question is about a problem of those working class coal miners in the Midwest. What would be possible for them to transition from their traditional business to other jobs, perhaps in this clean energy industry, so they wouldn't see this energy revolution as a zero sum, or worse still, feeling a sense of uselessness?
Let me take the second part of that question, and you guys feel free to jump in on the first. I think MIT is in the middle of doing a pretty deep dive into cataloging what the skills are of folks in the fossil fuel industry whose jobs may be threatened, and the skills are that might be more easily transitioned into in the renewable energy industry. And I think that's going to be very helpful. But clearly, you know, I was saying this to a group yesterday, that there's dignity in working with your hands, and a lot of people who are in those industries want that dignity of continuing to do that. And there is an awful lot of work in installation, for example, or in erecting wind turbines. But it's not going to happen if the state has not made a commitment to help that transition by creating a market for those kinds of products, right? So it has to be hand in glove. If there is a decline, and we know, I mean, coal employment peaked in the year, I think, 1913 or something like that, and there's, you know, nationally about 77,000 coal jobs. There's 260,000 solar jobs. So, and solar has increased 20% every year in the past 4 years. So there's clearly an opportunity there, but it has to be geographically proximate to where the pain is. And that's the challenge that I think a lot of politicians are grappling with in those communities, where they're expected to defend that industry and people see it as zero sum. Instead, there has to be a much more of an opportunity frame that we can help to give you the skills to be able to transition to these new things, but there has to be a market for it.
So let me just quickly to your point. We haven't really talked about the Paris Agreement, but one of the great ironies of the Paris Agreement is that the agreement itself was a very small c conservative agreement. And I think most of the people who sort of demagogue the agreement do it without really understanding what the agreement does. Because the agreement imposes no requirement on the United States or any other country to set specific emissions targets. Instead, the only requirement is that every country come forward with their own plan. So from the United States perspective, we did not give away any of our sovereign right to set our own policy according to our own predilections in the context of the Paris Agreement. the principal thing that we achieved in the Paris Agreement was a tool and a lever to hold other countries accountable, principally China, for when countries make collective commitments to address the climate issue, that we have a tool to hold them accountable such that their actions actually live up to their promised commitments. So the mandatory requirements under Paris are around reporting, review, and verification, which is a very powerful tool that we've never had before to actually look into the activities of, for example, the Chinese government and say, is there an inconsistency between your domestic subsidy policy on coal and your international coal financing, which there in fact is, and that's not consistent with the plan that you put forward in the Paris context. And so the great irony of Paris is stepping away from that process doesn't free the United States from the shackles of some sort of global agreement, because the agreement itself didn't impose hard domestic requirements on the United States. Instead, it just sort of it turns over the keys of a process that actually could hold other countries accountable. And as a result, I think that one of the implications, if that were to happen, one of the implications would be that it would be easier for China to claim the global mantle of leadership on this issue without as much constructive pressure to actually match its policies with that rhetoric. And I think that's unfortunate, but I also think it's a product of most folks not really totally understanding what the Paris Agreement itself actually is.
Can I just add one? It's just only an accounting point. It seems almost self-evident to me that to make real progress on this climate challenge, the United States is going to have to play a leadership role. But just from an accounting standpoint, given the projected growth in energy consumption around the world, the largest reductions are going to have to take place inside India and China and other developing countries. And so it's critical to have a system that keeps everyone, I think, engaged in some common goal. And so that's why I think the Paris Agreement is important.
Anything to add, Jeff?
The only thing I would add, we've talked a lot about, U.S. domestic policy, and we're, 12% of global emissions today, and that percentage is likely to shrink over time. I'm a little more skeptical of the Paris Agreement. I mean, you said, well, it's good because it holds their feet to the fire, but it's completely not binding on us. And as I understand, and you know better than I do, but the Chinese commitment was that it would try to have its emissions peak by 2030. There was no indication of how high they would get before they peaked, and then how far they would come down. So to say that somehow that imposed a real constraint on China, I think is not quite right. The bigger point, I think, is if you look at the progress that has been made in the United States, it's largely been driven by market forces, right? I mean, by the idea that we now have very inexpensive natural gas. The switch away from coal to natural gas is responsible for a big share of the reductions. And then, of course, the dramatic reductions in the cost of renewables, coupled with a lot of subsidies, and but ultimately, the problem we have today is the things that people want and feel like they're entitled to are things that are most easily given to them with fossil fuels. So almost everywhere in the world, the least expensive way to provide people with electricity is to burn coal. And the most efficient way to fuel transportation continues to be oil. And Michael and I have had this conversation once before. Whatever you think about the regulatory scheme, I think it's also important for the government to put in place not only policies, but financing mechanisms to encourage technology development. Because, in effect, if all we do is say everybody has to have more expensive electricity or more expensive transportation, I think ultimately that's not going to be possible in places like India, where you still have 200 billion people who don't have electricity. And China, where you have, at least that number, they don't have reliable electricity. And the reason people are building coal is not because they want to, they want to cause global warming. they're building coal around the world because they want to provide affordable, reliable electricity. And I think there's some hope that carbon capture and sequestration can be done at a affordable cost that will not. But at this point, we ought to be focusing much more on what can promote the kind of technology breakthroughs that will ultimately be needed to solve the problem. Because I don't think we're going to solve it through regulatory means.
Let me ask Michael 1 minute on this before we ask Colette for the last question. And in terms of the market forces, and this is a really interesting discussion about how far the market forces take us without this carbon price.
Yeah, so I think Jeff and I agree about a lot. We agree there's lots of room for improvement on technology, and that there should be investment, government investment in seeding advances in technology. But I disagree with the characterization of what's cheapest and what's not cheapest. It's a very particular definition to call coal the cheapest resource. That is true, it's absolutely true. And as long as you miss the pink elephant in the room, and the pink elephant is the damages associated with CO2 from using the carbon, and as long as you skip the air pollution damages associated with using coal. So if one takes account of those, which we, at least at the University of Chicago, call externalities, most people don't like using that in play company, but if you account for that, then the calculus starts to look very different.
No, I understand
And
that,
I know
but
you
most
know that
governments
well.
don't account for that, at least in other countries, at least so far.
But it also doesn't mean that if we fail to do it here, or someone fails to do it elsewhere, that doesn't mean that they're taking account of their citizens' welfare completely.
Let's get our last question from Colette.
Hi, I'm Colette. I'm a first-year student at Harris in environmental policy, and kind of expanding upon what you're talking about here about other countries don't do that. And it seems to me that the U.S. stands alone in really having this major disagreement of maybe there are different techniques globally as accounting for the cost of carbon, but I think here the fundamental disagreeing of like how to move forward. I mean, coal is no longer economically beneficial to keep building plants, and so I mean, what's missing, as Professor Greenstone put it, in accounting for the cost of the future, just in terms of like, is it going to take Mar-a-Lago sinking in 10 years to make people realize that this future might not be so far away?
So I think what you're asking about is sort of what if it's a more immediate problem instead of always thinking about it as something that's happening way up in the future?
What's the difference there in the fact that maybe we have a little bit of leeway as opposed to taking action now, really?
Look, I mean, one thing that I take some heart from the last exchange between Jeff and Michael is it does feel to me like we have agreement on this panel that market forces could go an extraordinary way towards solving this problem if markets appropriately accounted for the costs associated with fossil fuels, and that it is a problem that most countries around the world don't account for that currently. But there's an opportunity to solve that in ways that are efficient and effective and don't rely on ineffective regulatory solutions. And that's why I actually think that the characterization of this problem as markets versus regulation, I think it misses the core point, which is we could harness the power of the market to drive solutions if we appropriately priced the cost of carbon in place. And you can't be for that, but then against regulation, unless you have a way of pricing carbon that isn't regulation. And I'm less interested in whether the way you get to pricing carbon is regulation or legislation. I think that, ultimately legislation is implemented through regulation. And at the end of the day, what you care about is, do you have an efficient and effective carbon price in as much of the global economy as possible, and that we can have good debates about how best to define the social cost of carbon. I think that the effort that went into getting to the $37 a ton was very thoughtful. but you could certainly work to improve that over time. But I think the thing that we can't do is we can't allow, well, look, of course, there's always going to be inherent uncertainty about can you get that right? Or look, politics is hard and it's always going to be challenging to figure out how to get countries and political systems to, embed that price in market systems, to allow us to say, these issues are just too big and too complicated to solve. Because I think we all need to take some optimism from the fact that over the last decade, you've seen an extraordinary sea change in the political commitment on this issue and the economic penetration of cleaner sources of energy and cleaner sources of doing business. And it is really only in the United States. It's only the United States where this political argument is as pronounced and as central to the political debate. That whatever you think about other countries' policies, when you go into international negotiating arena or you go to capitals around the world, as I have over the last 2 years, we have fierce debates, but we don't have this partisan political debate anywhere else in the world other than the United States, which gives me some optimism. I don't know exactly how. We haven't solved it on this panel. But it gives me some optimism that this debate's days are numbered in the United States too. And the question is whether how much harm comes to the U.S. economy as an incident of that.
Well, I think we're ending on an optimistic note then. and our countdown clock is signaling meltdown here. So I just wanted to thank all of our panelists and the audience for the great questions and turn it over to Sam.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabina. In 1 minute, I'm going to ask you to clap again to join me in thanking our panelists, because I don't want people to think all that applause was for me. But I want to take the prerogative and close us out with just one maybe set of final thoughts, maybe even especially from Governor Granholm, but really from the rest of you as well, and Jeff, which is I think we did end on a very optimistic note. I do think that picking up on the question that the first student asked, it strikes me that I sort of reacted to the question the same way that Jeff did, which is to say that in the 1970s there was tremendous political mobilization around dealing with conventional pollution, and you frame the question in the context of what created the EPA. I mean, there was political momentum and support for that action, and we can go around and around forever about why that what happened in the early 2000s and Senator McCain and others, but it does seem that the political support for big actions on climate change, the kinds that we need to kind of execute on the areas where there is this kind of kernel of consensus on this panel, the idea of a national, hopefully legislative framework for dealing with carbon. The political consensus that would be required for that is not really there. And I just wonder, the jobs thing is interesting, but what is it going to take to get voters to come out and sort of demand that this happens? Because in the absence of that, it feels to me like we're going to be stuck in this world of battling over the legality and the economics of all these second best regulations, as you've more or less have all kind of referred to them that way.
If I can answer that, I don't know that citizens, unless you are, in a place where you've got a rising shoreline next to you, in the immediate, feel it, because it is a long-term strategy. But I do know, so I don't know whether you're going to have citizens on the right in particular rise up. But I do know that that the millennial generation, that those who are represented in this room at this university, that there is an overwhelming consensus, I think, on the right and the left in your generation that we should believe the scientists and that we should acknowledge we've got to fix this problem. And so my ending on an optimistic note is knowing that we're going to hand the baton to you all, and that I hope that you serve your country and raise your hand and run for office and put people in office that care about our planet. It's on you.
I think we'll end there. So please join me in thanking the panel for an excellent conversation.